Hello, family members. I hope you're having a nice day today. I'd like to talk to you today about something that I've seen kind of coming up in some marginalized communities that I really feel like it needs to be addressed. It's always an issue historically, it just never quite goes away. But for folks in marginalized communities, it's always going to be tempting to try to set yourself apart from the more controversial elements of your group. Let me give you a historical example here. So we all heard of Rosa Parks, right? But did you know 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and became part of American history, which is understandable. She did a lot, not just that, for the civil rights movement. There was a 15-year-old girl who did the exact same thing. She had gotten interested in the civil rights movement, A-plus student, really smart, ambitious young lady. And she said, I know my constitutional rights. It's against my constitutional rights. I'm not moving. And she was arrested. Her name was Claudette Colvin. And you may or may not have heard of her. The reason why is shortly after her arrest, it came out that she was pregnant. So we're talking about unwed teenage, mother. And the movement didn't think she was a good representative. And so they didn't use her act as an inflection point the way that they did with Rosa Parks. They chose Rosa because they thought she had a more respectable face to put on what they were trying to sell, essentially, to the country. That's not the only time that happened, even within the civil rights movement. There's the story of Bayard Rustin. I'm sorry, I'm really not certain that I'm saying his name correctly. I'm probably not. But he helped organize the March on Washington. He was like one of Dr. King's closest advisors. And he was almost entirely erased from the history of the civil rights movement because he was openly gay. And then we have things like what's going on now with, say, the LGB Alliance. Or, what's that? There's some really nasty young lady who's a lesbian who likes to call everybody else groomers. I can't remember what her name is. That's probably appropriate. She doesn't deserve name recognition. But I've seen her before. And you see these people out there that are trying to set themselves apart and say they're one of the good ones. Dead Domain just put out a whole video on Brianna Wu. I think that's another good modern example there. There are people who think that if they accept the bigot's premise that certain parts of the queer community are weird and scary and shouldn't exist, that they'll accept their right to exist. And it's really funny because that's been tried. They did that in Germany in the run-up to World War II. There were gay business leaders, magazine owners and such, that decided to try to capitulate and work with the Nazis. They went with the can't beat them, so join them thing, and they couldn't join them. They weren't allowed. Eventually the Nazis just came for them too. That's what happens. It's the leopards eating your face thing. And civil rights movements for marginalized communities do not benefit by downplaying the existence of their more controversial elements. Trans people are not better off if they are binary transes that can pass for their correct gender and don't want to have anything to do with non-binary people. Well, sorry, that's not how it works. You can try to set yourself apart, but bigots will just toss you right back in the group with the rest of us. Like me, I'm not gender non-conforming in like any sort of like strict sense, but I certainly, with this short hair and the fact that I can't wear makeup and jewelry, I'm sure I read to people often. They think I'm like, gender fluid, or who knows what they think, but even though that I'm cis, I can see that it's not good to put a target on non-binary people, and not just because it hurts them. It hurts us all. It doesn't do what you want it to do, and it makes everyone else less safe. That seems like a lose-lose sort of scenario as far as I'm concerned. I am so tired of seeing this happen again and again. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Washington really got the gay rights movement going. They were part of what organized and made a community that then was able to do more. And their stories are marginalized. They'll talk about Harvey Milk because he's more respectable. They'll talk about like the respectable gays while ignoring that the community is bigger than that. Like this, like the turfish thing, the LGB Alliance just drives me crazy. Because not only are they casually getting rid of trans people there, they're also just, by extension, ignoring intersex people, asexuals, aromantics, queer people of all type that don't fit. I mean, technically they're leaving out pansexuals and polysexuals and omnisexuals, Like, there is a reason why there are all these different micro labels. And I understand that if you don't identify with the labels, that they're hard to understand the nuances of. A lot of people have trouble with demisexual because, they kind of assume that it's sort. All right, so demisexual people are only attracted to someone sexually after they have established a romantic or some other type of existing relationship. They need other type of intimacy before the sexual attraction comes. And when you tell people that, they'll be like, well, isn't that just normal? And no. There are people who find people attractive they've never met or have no relationship with. They just see them for the first time. Love at first sight. Have you ever heard of that? That's, and the exact opposite of how it works for demisexuals, okay? And that's why there needs to be a word for it, because it's something distinct from the way that the majority experiences their sexual attraction. And when you don't fit in the majority, it's very lonely. And it allows people to find other people who are like them and support each other. And I don't expect everybody in the queer community to know every single micro label. That's basically impossible. Because micro labels, I mean, there's no like micro label council that gets to decide what label is a real label versus what word we're using for what. I mean, there are multiple labels that really overlap or describe the same thing too. Um, Agosexual and autocresial, I don't know how I'm supposed to say the other version of it, but there's two words for the same identity. Because the small communities that fit that label find each other and create the label. And then it spreads. And it's possible, because this is happening in isolation, that more than one ideal will be put forth. I mean, there's with pride flags, it's the same thing. You know, the aromantic flag has two versions, one with yellow and one without. I prefer the one without yellow, I'll be honest. And that is the more common of the two. But there is another version, because these communities are existing in parallel. And when we give ourselves terminology, when we give ourselves iconography like flags, that helps disparate parts of our community find each other. And erasing us from the conversation on queer rights is dangerous, because it is saying that we're not as important, that we're lesser, that we're not as valid, or like we're just cringe, you know? I hate to use that word, but I think that's really what a lot of like cis gay people think when they look at people who use micro labels. They think that we're just, you know, sort of embarrassing. You know, they don't want to have to learn about us, because they don't want to have to be advocates for us. They just want to advocate for themselves. And one part of the queer community advocating for itself on its own is never going to be enough to protect us. We need that unity. We need the support of each other. And it's funny to me, because I feel like the majority of lesbians really get that. Like almost every lesbian I know is super cool with any kind of queer person that they've ever encountered. I've never seen that anti-queer bigotry from lesbians. Now I know it exists, because there's things like the LGBT Alliance, and there's a bunch of very, unfortunately, very famous British anti-trans rights activists who are lesbians. You know, give that little queer stamp of approval on bigotry. Why not, you know? But it seems like it's a big problem to me when I spend time around gay men. The bigotry is, I mean, there's a lot of misogyny and racism out of these white queer guys that I know. And it's just like, they think, oh, well, I got mine, I don't need to worry about you. Yeah. That's just not how it works, though, you know? When I was reading about Rustin, I found out that in the 80s, he met someone who was significantly younger than him, and they fell in love. And he wanted to ensure that when he passed away, his estate would pass to his partner. But this was the 80s. There was no gay marriage. And so what he had to do, the legally sound thing to do in that situation, was for him to legally adopt his partner. I mean, it's just so absurd. And this was, you know, like during my lifetime. This was right around the time I was born that happened in like 82. And here we are 43 years later, and gay people have been getting married. Well, queer people have been getting married. Same-sex people have been getting married for like more than a decade, and it's not a big deal. Well, I mean, for the most part, it's not a big deal. I know that there are people in the government right now who would really like to overturn it, and that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. But public opinion has really changed on that. And it's kind of hard to take away someone's marriage once it's been formalized, I I think that's more complicated than they want to think it is. It's like all these like attempts to get trans people out of the military and not provide trans health care. And the military is very much a results-driven organization, and they know that trans people being in the military is not harmful. And so these attempts just kind of fizzle out. It doesn't really work long term because it's just an ideological desire to erase the existence of trans people entirely. And because you can't do that, because trans people are going to exist whether you want them to or not, no matter what you do, then eventually reality is going to butt up against what the ideologues want. And reality often pushes ideology out of the way. Cold, hard reality, I mean, look at Trump and his tariffs. He did that whole thing where he made it seem like he put a pause on them, which is there. He still did a flat 10% tariff on the entire world. The pause really wasn't a pause. It was just some of the countries won't be tariffed as much, at least at first. See, had to do something to give the appearance of responding to the concerns that his buddies had in the bond markets, and his ideology of tariffs are amazing eventually ran up against the brick wall of the bond market is crashing, and he had to make it look like he was rolling everything back, although that's not really what he did. And he's taken a lot of flack for it. People say, oh, he blinked, oh, he's a loser. But he had to do it because his ideology had to give way when it ran into the immovable fact that it was causing our economy to collapse in just a matter of days. And, while I know that a lot of people appreciate the fact that he did kind of change course a little bit, I don't think people realize it's too late. When your ideology runs up against the brick wall of truth and is crushed to pieces, there's a lot of collateral damage. When you push your ideology to the point where reality has to give you a smack in the face to tell you, hey, you're wrong about this, you've already caused a lot of damage before you get to that point. It doesn't matter that you weren't able to continue to your ideological end. You have still created a trail of bodies behind you, metaphorically, on the way to that final crash. We have to, as a queer community, raise up people of color, poor people, unhoused people, people who are looked down on by society, convicts, disabled people. Did I already say that? I don't know. I can't remember. Mentally ill people. I mean, like, this is the time for us to truly understand that intersectionality is the only way to make progress. And intersectionality helped drive the civil rights movement with people like Rustin and Colvin. And even though there's this attempt to remove them from the narrative retrospectively, to remove Martha and Sylvia respectively, you can't remove the fact that they were essential to the movement, that they were part of it, and it wouldn't have worked the way it did without them. The broader community needs every corner of its like, here's the thing that just drives me crazy is you don't get to choose if you're in a marginalized community. It just, you are or you aren't. And when you see these people who get into the respectability politics, like Ben Shapiro or Vivek or Tim, what's his face? Tim, the one who really, darn. Okay, well, Scott, Tim Scott, that one. Sorry. But like, look at them. You know, they try to weasel their way into those movements and make themselves one of the good ones. And I don't know what the heck Tim Scott is doing right now, but it sure isn't being Trump's vice president, no matter how much he groveled. Okay? And I don't care how right-wing, grievance peddling Ben Shapiro wants to be. There are still great numbers of people within the movement he wants to be part of that will never, ever accept him simply because he is Jewish, which is not good, but that's also kind of how it has to be. You know, if he wants to pretend like the right wing is not an inherently anti-Semitic movement, if he wants to believe ideologically that he can still be part of that movement and be Jewish, he is constantly running up against that brick wall of reality where there are anti-Semites who are in the party who will never, ever, ever let him forget that he is not one of them. And I'm sure that happens pretty often with, say, Usha Vance. I mean, we've seen that. And her husband didn't exactly stand up for her very well, did he? Like, you can try to be respectable, but you don't get to decide if you're viewed that way. And when you join a group of ideological bigots who want to exclude you based on some intrinsic characteristic, you might be able to be part of the movement. You might get to be the little token whatever, but you're never going to get the full respect. It's always going to be a very tenuous relationship, and there's never going to be a floor to how low you have to stoop, how much you have to degrade yourself to just try to stay within what they consider acceptable. You know, you can be Dave Rubin. I don't know why you would want to be. You can be Ellen. Again, I don't know why you would want to be. Or you can be like Rustin or Colvin, Johnson, Rivera. All these people who went out and did the hard work, not for glory or credit, because they knew it needed to be done, because they saw people who were struggling and dying and needed justice. And I'd much rather be the unacceptable queer person, disabled queer woman, overweight. I'd rather be me than any of those, successful, influential, respectable queers. Or disabled people, or what. I don't even really see disabled people that much in the right-wing movement, do you? Telling. Although, to be fair, you don't see disabled people very much in the left wing or the Democrats at all. I mean, think about it. The only president that we had that was wheelchair bound, that was disabled, it was like the biggest open secret. Like the press didn't report on it because they didn't want to undermine him. The only way we were able to get away with having a disabled president was by making sure that everyone who needed to believe he wasn't disabled believed that. Which is frustrating. You don't have to be able to walk to be a good president. You don't have to be able to hear or see, because you know what? There are plenty of different kinds of accommodations that can be done, we don't allow people who are visibly disabled to be our leaders. We don't allow people who are visibly gender nonconforming to be our leaders. And when somebody tries to step up and do that, they don't get the respect they deserve. They may be tokenized. They may be looked at with pity, especially if you're disabled, which is really frustrating. I think we knew better than this. I do. I think that we have to let go of this idea that compromise on things like bigotry is possible. Compromising with bigots just means that the bigotry gets more empowered, and then you have to compromise more. They'll always try to take more ground. They'll always try to take it, and you can't give an inch. And I know it's got to feel frustrating. I know that it's hard to advocate for people you don't understand. And I think that's why we need to see left-leaning leadership do better as far as embracing these marginalized within marginalized communities and getting to know them on a personal level. When I started my mythical series a while back, where I decided I was going to explain micro-labels to people, I didn't get very far into the series before I realized that it was going to be impossible for me to continue it by myself. I had no problem at all explaining micro-labels that either I identify with or that I had researched thinking might fit me at some point in my life. But when it comes to micro-labels that I don't have a personal familiarity, especially any that are related to being trans, I have no idea what that experience is like, and it's really hard for me to appropriately explain those labels, right? You don't know until you know. That's why we need our little personal spaces for micro communities, but we also need to be a very important part of the whole. I was 35 before I found out that there was an aromantic community, that it wasn't just me, that I wasn't broken. And it infuriates me that I could have had a completely different outlook on my life if I had only been given the vocabulary to understand that this is just who I am and it's nothing to worry about, you know? Like, I don't need to try to make myself a heterosexual woman because I'm not a heterosexual woman. I'm just not. And when you finally find that home, and then you start to realize that other people within the queer community think that you're just got to be a special snowflake, or that there's no need for a romantic inclusion. Breaks your heart a little bit, you know? You're like, I found my spot. I feel comfortable. And then you realize, oh, no. Even within this group, I'm going to be part of the odd one out. It's demoralizing. It's hard to want to work for the movement when you feel like you're not going to be fully embraced as part of it. And so it's time to abandon this. It's time to abandon the idea of respectability politics. It did not work in Germany in the World War II period. It did not work in the Civil Rights period. Didn't work in the gay rights period. Didn't work in the disability rights period. I mean, I have to get into disability rights some other time because I don't have enough time right now. But Judy Heumann is my hero. And she went out there and made people see her, whether they wanted to or not. And that's what I'm doing right now. Hey, I'm here. I'm aromantic. I'm aegosexual. I'm pan-oriented. I'm a woman. I have never been married. I don't have kids. I am, just a dog and cat.